I had not planned on doing a Ron Paul video today, but a friend of mine, it's on YouTube, but I know mostly from Facebook. He's from the UK, and he said that a relative of his, I believe an uncle, said that Ron Paul is not good because his policies will hurt the poor and support the rich. And so he had asked that I make a video addressing this. Now, I told him straight up that that's actually an enormous topic, and there's no way anybody could cover it in one video, certainly not me. But what the hell, I couldn't say no to this guy, so I'm going to try and break this down to be pretty quick. The first point is, as he placed it to me, and this is common, is there's an inherent assumption that there is an antagonism between either the rich or the poor, or employees and employers, and that government policy must favor one or the other, or there must be a government policy and it's going to have to favor one or the other, and that they are basically antagonistic classes. First of all, I kind of reject that thesis. People can cooperate, and it can be mutually beneficial for the two of them. In fact, whenever two parties cooperate voluntarily, we can assume that at least they believe that they are both benefiting. Now, it is always possible for people in hindsight to say, hey, maybe that wasn't a good deal, but it's very hard to say as a third party looking down that it's wrong if two people are agreeing. Now, there's two different but related very, very broad categories here that each one would actually be more than an entire video. One is, do government programs that are designed to help the poor work, and do government programs restrain or restrict the depredations or predations, should we assume they exist, of the super rich, the mega rich, whatever. And where does Ron Paul fit into this? Well, the first question is, do government programs help the poor? And the answer to that is no. Now, the government has deep pockets, that's certainly true, and the government says that it's trying to help the poor, and there are certainly people within the government who believe that. In fact, I'd say the majority of people, at least at the functionary level of government, think that they are helping the poor. But because they say that they are, because that they hope that they are, and because they spend a lot of money, doesn't mean that they are actually doing that. The federal government has all kinds of plans to help Iraq, and yes, we can point to buildings that they've built, but on net, the federal government's involvement in Iraq has been an unmitigated and absolute catastrophe on every conceivable level to that country. It's been so bad that it can be very easily argued that Saddam Hussein, a butcher, was better. And that's not an endorsement of him, it's just to say relative to the beneficence of the U.S. government, it's a better plan, and I can go on and on and on. We can't just assume that because they say they're going to do something nice and they spend a lot of money, that that's actually what happens. Without going into too many details, using the government's own studies. Now, the government actually kind of initiated studies of their programs because when they first began them, there have always been a few very small ones. They kind of got a little uptick in the 50s where the federal government started to get a little bit more involved, and then big time in the mid-60s. And they decided, well, we need to have some kind of way to find out whether what we're doing is being effective or not. And the conclusion that they basically come to is that some people do get helped. However, those are the people who are very outgoing, who are trying very hard to succeed, and to them the government subsidy is just, that's an opportunity, they take it and they run with it, and they are able to transfer whatever it is, the work training or the education or whatever, into meaningful net returns. However, the majority of people who take advantage of the program don't use it in that way. They just see it as something to exploit, and not in a self-bettering way, but in kind of a, here's a free lunch, let's just eat, as long as there's a free lunch available, let's take advantage of it. And the problem is with even those who who are benefited, the consensus is, well, they're out trying to better themselves to stop being poor, so it's not really necessary for the government to offer them a subsidy, because sooner or later that would come anyway. Sooner or later, a brother or a cousin or somebody would, or help wanted ad would give them a job that would help. And so the program, yes, it benefited some people, but those people more than likely would have gained otherwise. And on the other hand, it creates this whole class of other poor people who become dependent and who don't move up. And I know anecdotally, my father teaches at a very, very poor school. Well over a majority of the students, in fact, I think it's more like 80 or 90%, but I don't know the details, are receiving government aid. They're all on welfare. And you know what the kids talk about at school? They don't talk about how, hey, my mom and dad are getting welfare, and so I'm going to use that to study really hard and get a good job. Or what they talk about is how they're going to game the system and how smart they are, because they think that they're going to get all this free stuff. And they will get free stuff, but they're not very smart, because their level of wealth and prosperity will be kept at a low ebb forever. And I've seen this over and over and over again. When I've spent most of my life working with poor people, working in fast food. Even now, a lot of the people I work with, they're poor. They're using change to buy ramen poor. And I've known, like when I worked in fast food, I knew a lot of people who thought that they were gaming the system because they were getting, you know, a free rent on their house. But as a result of that, they kept their incomes low on purpose, because if they ever got a raise, if they ever became, say, a manager, or got a better job, then they wouldn't get the subsidy. So you know what they did? They consciously never got a better job. And so, well, most of us will work at Burger King like I did when we were young, when we were in high school or maybe in college. We move on from there, and I have moved on there. I make more in a day now than I would make in an entire week at Burger King. But you know what? That the people I'm thinking of, they're still there. And they're still making way less, and they don't even know what it means to live, and they never will. So you can't take it for granted that because the government is claiming to help the poor and spends a lot of money to that it actually is. Now, the other problem, the other kind of pillar here, is the government restrains the predations of big business, the rich, whatever. This is categorically not true. It is a fact that rich people, the politically connected, have more sway on the government than do poor. They are able to, even if they can't win by a mass voting technique, mass democracy, they can win because they can buy the ear. They can get influence. So yes, we can all vote and get the man we want, Barack Obama, but when he decides how to govern, it's going to be a whole bunch of very wealthy, shady characters who are going to have way more say in that than the multitudes of crying people who think he's going to deliver them from everything. As a rule, state regulation of big business, or business generally, has really been a form of regulatory capture and competition destruction. By and large, the government regulating industries is there to protect usually either a particular favored industry or basically all established industries. They'll grandfather in, they'll make it very hard for new competitors to enter the market, and that actually helps the established businesses. Try right now to go into business as a butcher in the United States. It shouldn't be that difficult. It's not that hard to buy cows. It's not that hard to buy land. Those are the two things you have to have. You have to know how to butcher a cow, which is something that can be learned without going to school or whatever. And there are literally millions and millions of Americans who would have at least the technical ability to become butchers of some kind, maybe not of cows, but of chickens, of all kinds of stuff. But it is basically illegal. They'd have to go through all these government hoops, and that's just fine by the Walmarts of the world. They just assume that you don't have the option of buying fresh beef from Amish people, which, by the way, we do in our area anyway, because they're basically gray market to the max. They can't really be regulated. But the idea that the government is acting as some kind of cage protecting the poor people from the rapacious corporations or rich is false. So those are the two, like, very broad categories about libertarianism generally, but not specifically addressing Paul. Now, to address Paul specifically, he, for one, says, yes, all these welfare programs are wrong. He says not only are they unconstitutional, but they don't work, which is correct. But he also says, look, I'm a pragmatist. I know that I can't get those things canceled, and so his first priorities are to cut spending and foreign policy. And so it is somewhat of a moot point when we talk about his policies in terms of elected candidate. About if you really believe that the welfare programs are effective, which of course there's no evidence for that other than just taking the government's word for it, which is a very dubious rubric for deciding whether they're effective or not. He is not making it a priority to get rid of them. So there are three areas, three policies that he would do that would benefit the poor, leaving aside now the debate between government subsidy of general welfare programs generally and big business specifically. Number one is he wants to drastically cut inflation, cut spending, reduce the debt. Now, this will cause deflation, which is usually considered evil, or in fact, it's come to the point now where a lot of economists will say if there's a deflation, that's proof that there's a depression. However, this is not a very good determinant for economic doom, because the entire last half of the 19th century was a deflationary era in the United States. And yet that's the time when we went from an agrarian society to the wealthiest, most powerful, richest, most industrial, most productive society in history. And it was deflationary. Rather than talk all about deflation, let's just make it real clear. What deflation would mean is that you would see a rise in the real value of wages. Even if you don't get a raise, if you're still getting paid so many dollars per hour, those so many dollars will buy you more and more. Or put another way, the things that you buy will become cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And these have a disproportionately positive effect on those at the margin, at the bottom. Yes, it's true that if you want to buy a yacht, it will also be cheaper, or a Rolls Royce, it will also be cheaper. Especially imports, all things imported will be cheaper. But it makes a much bigger difference in your personal economy, and that's actually what economy means, like the personal finances or whatever, if you're poor. There's a huge difference if feeding yourself for a week costs, say, $10 or $100, or feeding yourself and your family costs $100 versus if it costs $85. That's a big change. And that's an arbitrary ratio of how much inflation there would be, but you would see an increase in your purchasing power, which also would encourage you to save, but everything would be getting cheaper. Your gas would be getting cheaper, your food would be getting cheaper, clothing would be getting cheaper, and over time, even things like rent would go down. So that would help the poor. Inflation hurts them. We're seeing right now massive price inflation. It's being understated by the government. They keep coming up with new ways to say it's not really inflation. They just throw out the prices of everything that's going up a lot, like gold and oil and food, and then they just say, well, we're only going to count the things that aren't really going up. But food is definitely going up. Now, if you're rich, you can afford that. If it costs, a rich person isn't going to spend millions of times more money on their food. I mean, they might throw a big banquet, but on their personal intake, it's not going to be that much different than a poor person. But if there's a lot of inflation, which there's going to be under all presidential contenders outside of Paul, he's the only one who's even close to talking about reducing inflation. Even the other plans by, like, say, Paul Ryan, they only slow the increase. So the inflation will be terrible, but not quite as terrible as Paul would be talking about an actual end of inflation. And then I think by default, just by his actions, there would actually be deflation. I think the dollar would strengthen because people say, hey, he's serious about this. The value of the dollar is going to be very good relative to what it otherwise would be. So we'll see deflation. That'll help the poor. Second, this is a little bit more controversial, but he will reduce all these ridiculous regulations. At least this is the other qualification here is what would his plan be and what would he actually get accomplished, because those are two very separate questions. We can wonder what exactly Congress would allow to get passed. Of course, there also is the possibility that he could basically legalize things by fiat, simply by promising to pardon them, at least for federal crimes, that would be a de facto nullification of a law. He couldn't pass positive legislation that way. He couldn't say everyone has to do what I say or they'll go to jail. But what he could say is Congress won't pass my repeal of, say, minimum wage laws, but I will pardon anybody who is brought to trial for that at the federal level. That would de facto end minimum wage laws. Now, this is something that a lot of people have a bugaboo about, but honestly, it's not a big deal. It would eliminating minimum wage and other regulations would basically make it easier to get a job. It doesn't mean that everyone who gets a job is going to have a great job. It doesn't mean that you would be satisfied with the job you might get, but you're hardly in a position, whoever you are, to be telling people that a certain quantity of pay for a certain set of a certain amount of labor given is inappropriate. No, nobody is in a position to make that claim onto other people. If they take the job, obviously they think that it's worth it. And so denying that opportunity, how is that helping them at all? It's not. If it makes you feel good that you get to say, oh, I envision a society where everybody makes a living wage, whatever that is, but in the meantime, you're telling somebody that they can't make a wage that they obviously think is worthwhile, otherwise they wouldn't have agreed to it. So there will be much more opportunities. Basically, unemployment, involuntary unemployment, will be impossible. There'll still be unemployment because there are going to be people who decide they don't want to work for a while, and that's not always a sign of laziness. You know, some people are like, I want to take a vacation, or I just finished school and I want to take the summer off, or I'm between jobs or whatever. But if you want to work, there'll be someone willing to hire you at some price, and I can guarantee you that some cash flow is better than no cash flow, no matter how small it is. And if it's so small that it's not worth the effort, then people won't put the effort. If someone says, I'll give you a penny a day to work 8 hours, then let's say I'd be better off begging or starting my own turnip garden than going there. So it's elimination of the regulations doesn't mean that everyone will now make nothing. In fact, it's obviously not the case. Currently, the vast majority of people make more than government-mandated minimums. The vast majority of people. If the only thing that was keeping wages above nothing was government fiat, then everybody would be making that government minimum and not more. And the fact that people make more is a testament to the fact that there are market forces that drive up wages in addition to, and actually far stronger than, any declaration by a well-meaning politician. Likewise, there wouldn't really be abasement because there's a low point beyond which nobody is going to be willing to work. But that middle ground should not be cut away. Also, getting rid of the regulations would allow people to go into businesses, like I mentioned, becoming a butcher. I was just reading a book, a really great book actually, called The Market for Liberty by the Tannenhills. And it's a classic book, and I put off reading it, and I'm glad I am. Even though I'm not learning a ton new, they put it in a good way. He said, what about, say, a black guy who can't get a job at a factory, he can't get a job anywhere, so what does he do? He goes and he starts to make sandwiches and starts to sell them to the foreman, to the workers at the factory that won't hire him. He knows how to make sandwiches, and he goes out and starts doing it. He figures how much it costs for him to make it. He charges a little bit extra. He makes a living. That's practically impossible now. In order for him to do that, he would have to jump through so many bureaucratic hoops that it would cost him more than he could ever even hope to make in the first place. So he's just not even going to try. And why should he? The government will shut him down. And you can say, oh, what about food safety? Well, if the foremen don't trust his cooking skills, then they have every right not to patronize him. Sorry about the glare. So that's the second thing, the reduction of regulation generally, specifically minimum wage, though. The third, and the first being deflation, now the third is the war on drugs. The war on drugs disproportionately hurts poor people. That's a fact. Literally millions of poor people are thrown into prison, are shackled. Even if they don't go to prison, they're shackled by the judicial system, so-called. They are almost defenseless against it. It is possible. The jurisprudence of the United States isn't bad. The common law, the basis of the law, is not bad. There's supposedly a high level that the government has to prove to convict you of being guilty. You're innocent until proven guilty. You're entitled to a trial by your jury. However, the system is rigged such that unless you have a rather large amount of money, you are unable to even function in the system, and you get railroaded. And I mean, again, I know lots of people who are like this. I have coworkers who are like this. The government can be very capricious and arbitrary, and there's not a lot you can do. Most poor people, especially rich people, can defend themselves in court. Rich people can get away with murder sometimes. There are some very famous examples of that because they have enough money that they can use it in the system. If you are poor, you cannot do that. If you get charged with having marijuana, possession, selling, cocaine, whatever, you're not going to have the minimum $5,000 to $10,000 it's going to take to defend yourself, and almost nobody is going to have the know-how and wherewithal to do it themselves. That is legal. There are ways to do that. However, that takes a lot of research and a lot of cojones, something that most people, myself included, don't have. Although I'm thinking about rectifying that. You need $5,000 to $10,000 minimum to get a lawyer. Obviously, the government will appoint you a lawyer, but that's a joke. They work for the government. If you start telling them, I want to plead innocent, I want a trial by jury, they just look at you like, well, you don't want my counsel, then screw you. All they do is they act as a conduit for a plea bargain. That's all public defenders are. And it's cliche, maybe you've heard it before, but every single time I know anyone who goes to court, that's what happens. Every single time. This obviously hurts the poor far more than the rich. The rich can pay these fines. They can navigate the legal system. They can afford the people who can operate in the legal cartel. And there is a legal cartel. The Bar Association is a legal cartel. You're allowed to defend yourself, but not others. So even, let's say I was really good at getting out parking tickets. I couldn't go to my buddies and say, hey, if you want to get a parking ticket, get me. That would be totally illegal. In fact, there are even cases where people have defended their children, like 8-year-old children. Their parents try and defend them, and they get sued by the Bar Association in their respective state. And so that doesn't help the poor at all. Throwing them in prison for non-crimes like selling or using drugs doesn't help the poor. And that's like 1 million people. It's actually more than 1 million when you think about it. That's how many are in prison. But if you talk about how many are in some level of probation or whatever, have their records, they can't get a job ever again, or they can only get a low-skilled job. They get followed. They get warrantless searches. They lose the right to vote sometimes. They lose the right to own a gun. Ron Paul's policies, he would have the power through pardon to basically end the drug war, which would be an enormous boon to the poor and would not affect the rich at all. It's not like the rich don't use drugs. The rich do use drugs, but they're able to afford to stay around, and they're not targeted either. I mean, clearly, the police aren't going around pulling over Rolls Royces and Bentleys, going out searching yachts for people smoking weed. They're doing that to cheap cars in the ghetto, in the urban areas, in the poor areas. That's where they go. That's who they clamp down on. That's who gets hurt, and that's an enormous chain on poor people that Ron Paul would be happy to break. Let's see, and as I was talking about that, I just thought of another one. This one's probably not going to fly in the UK, but also gun rights. Poor people can't afford to defend themselves with security forces like, say, the president does. They can't build nice security fences with alarms and, all that. The only way they can defend themselves really effectively is to own firearms, and obviously Ron Paul is the man for that. Although I realize that's maybe not tactically the best thing for me to mention, but big government attempts to help poor people by banning guns in urban centers has been an enormous disaster. It has caused, or at least it hasn't caused so much as it's aggravated the crime situation in the inner cities. It's made them very dangerous, whereas the rest of the country, which has not been inflicted by this big government protection, has been much, 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 much safer. Ron Paul would be in a position to pardon people who are convicted of crimes like that, and to urge the proliferation of cheap weapons to the society. I know this point is probably wrong, since this is going to be directed at someone in the UK who will likely have quibbles about firearms ownership, but the point stands. Right now, the price of guns is artificially inflated because of federal regulations against them. There are literally millions and millions of guns that could be imported in the United States. The United States has the ability to absorb basically the world market in firearms, but instead the federal government prevents their importation, or at least large numbers of them, which is part of the reason they end up in Africa. If you ever watched the movie Lord of War, the only reason they're bothering selling guns to dictators in Sierra Leone and Liberia is because those guns can't be sold in the United States, which is a shame, because there's more. I mean, the rednecks and the rich oil tycoons are more than willing to spend more on an AK-47 than ID'd or whoever else in Africa wants to buy them with blood diamonds or whatnot. But for the poor in America, that would lower the price enormously. They'd be able to arm themselves much more effectively. Obviously, of course, the crime would go down also because the drug war would be over, and that's the actual main source of most of the homicide in the United States is the war on drugs, which, of course, is killing poor people left and right like it's nobody's business, and ending that would aid them. Now, I guess the other thing I should mention is healthcare. This is related to the deregulation. There's every bit of reason to assume, and all the evidence suggests, that a deregulation of the medical field, something that Ron Paul knows more about than anybody you're going to ever find, would cause the price to fall. The quality would go up and the price would fall. Now, that will benefit everybody, but it will benefit the poor the most, by far. Rich people, they already can afford it. They're going to be saving money. Good for them. Poor people are going to be in a position where previously they couldn't afford it. As it becomes cheaper, more and more of them. Not necessarily all of them all at once. That's utopian, but more and more of them will be able to afford it better and better. Healthcare, and of course I could ditto that to every other good and service, basically. So Ron Paul his policies, if he got whatever he wanted, would be absolutely astounding for the poor. His policies, as they could be implemented practically with the legislative process, would still be a very great step in advantage for the poor and for everybody else, for that matter. The only people who would be suffered would be the crony capitalists, the industries that are dependent on subsidy and that are dependent on regulatory capture to prevent competition. Those are the people who would suffer, and those people are not poor. So, all right, that's it.